Hello, I'm the Dark Master. In today's nature documentary, we shall be discussing an animal group I've mentioned several times before, the Xiphosura, or as they are more well known as, the horseshoe crabs, who are today represented only by four species that are iconic in human culture due to their mass spawnings and their status as quote-unquote living fossils, supposedly being unchanged for over 400 million years. However, this last claim to fame has gotten a bit contentious. As to why? Well, you see, it ties into the contention of what exactly is a living fossil, and hopefully this video can provide an answer to the question of whether horseshoe crabs are living fossils or not, which is not as black and white as other YouTubers may paint it as. It's also an excuse to talk in depth about a group that I've been meaning to do ever since I finished my extinct invertebrate iceberg for last year's Halloween special. But before any of that, I figure I should probably answer the question you have. What exactly is a horseshoe crab? Alright, so on a basic level, all animals more derived than a jellyfish-sized sponge are divided into two groups based on embryological development. First are the deuterostomes, whose first opening becomes the anus. These include such animals like echinoderms, such as starfish, acorn worms, and chordates like frogs and people. More relevant for us are the second group, the protostomes, which have their first opening form into the mouth. The protostomes are themselves divided into two main groups. First are the Spiralia, who are distinguished by unique spiral cleavage seen in their embryos, and consist of such animals as rotifers, mollusks, flatworms, and segmented worms like leeches. But it is with the second of these two groups that we see stuff more relevant for this video, the Ecdysozoa, so named for all possessing growth by ecdysis, which is the shedding of an external cuticle. This group itself is divided into two more branches, discounting some obscure basal clades like Saccharitidae that are now extinct. First of these two are the Scelidophora, a grouping of three rather obscure clades, the Priapulids, better known as penis worms for pretty obvious reasons, as well as the macroscopic Roricopheridae and the Chinorrhynchia, also called mud dragons. These are united by several morphological features, and most notable of which is these rings of scalids in their exoskeleton. They are absent in the second group, and the one more relevant of the two clades we'll be discussing, the Cryptovermes. They themselves are divided into two groups. First are the Nematoida, which consist of the famous nematodes and the extremely similar but more obscure Nematomorpha, also called horsehair worms or hair snakes. More relevant for this video are the Panarthropoda, which are distinguished from their sister group by a segmented body, paired appendages that are connected with said segments, and a paired ladder-like ventral nervous system. This group itself is divided into three phyla, discounting some paraphyletic groups like Lobopodia and the enigmatic Cyalomorpha, which may be its own phylum. First up are the tardigrada, better known as the water bears or moss piglets. They consist of around 1,500 species of little guys, known for their infamous survivor ability. Next up are the onychophora, a group of around 200 species notable for giving live birth, spraying slime to catch prey, and being the only phylum of animals that are entirely terrestrial in habit in terms of their modern members. But it is the last phylum that outshines them both and outnumbers the rest, and in which we see the subject for the rest of the video, the arthropoda. The arthropoda are distinguished from their relatives by a mineralized exoskeleton, a body with differentiated segments, and jointed legs, which is where they got the name from. Now this is a massive group, and while this time I won't be talking about nearly as many derived clades, there are still far too many basal clades to discuss them all. But to keep it brief, the arthropoda are divided into four main clades. Most basal are the arthropoda, who are most famous for the trilobites, for whom I already made a 14-part video series on, and hope to do several more relatively soon. So check that out for more info on them. All remaining arthropods alive today are divided into two clades. On one side, we got the mandibulata, who possess a pair of modified legs called mandibles for processing food. These include the myriapods, crustaceans, insects, and a number of basal forms. But it's with their sister group that we find the subject of the video, the Silicerata, so named for their possession of silicerae, which are a modified set of legs and are the only appendages before the mouth in this group, as they lack mandibles as well as antennae. This group itself consists of several basal clades like the Habelida, the Mollisonida, and possibly the Megacheira. But the living ones consist of two branches. First are the bizarre Pycnogonida, often called sea spiders, which, while yes, live in the ocean, are not spiders. They consist of 1,300 species of bizarre animals. Second and more relevant are the Eusilicerata, or true silicerates. Outside of a few basal clades like Wegbergina and the Olphacolidae, all the Eusilicerata are in the group Prosomopoda, which are distinguished from earlier forms by the lack of exopods, which are these outer branches on their second to fifth appendages in the adults. A bit obscure, but a unique trait regardless. Outside of a few basal genera like Borcangonia and the taxonomic paraphyletic dumpster fire of Xiphosura, all remaining silicerates are divided into two groups. First are the Planeturga, which includes arachnids like spiders, scorpions, ticks, and their extinct cousins, the Eurypterids, aka sea scorpions, and various others. But more relevant to us are the Xiphosura, whose name means sword tail, in reference to the group sword-like telson. These are the group which you could call the horseshoe crabs, even though they're not really crabs. Historically, you'd see them lumped in with Eurypterids in the class of Merostomata, but this is now considered paraphyletic, and both groups just sort of have a larger amount of basal characteristics and are not necessarily closely related to each other. Speaking of that, now that we've put them in their taxonomic position, let's discuss their anatomy a bit, so that we can understand some terms we'll hear later, and how they're quite unchanged compared to the more well-known arachnids from the basal silicerate condition. So, the horseshoe crab's anatomy consists of two main segments. First up is the prosoma, effectively the head and front body. They have 10 eyes, though the two largest are the most notable and used for finding mates. The others help detect light levels and, other such stuff. Flipping them over, we see 6 pairs of legs. The first 4 pairs are used for movement and gathering food. The 5th pair are used for helping to punch mud out of the way and cleaning the animal's gills. They have a 6th pair of vestigial legs called cellaria. The second body part is the Opisthosomal, which in modern horseshoe crabs is fused into one, but in earlier forms there were multiple segments. But they usually only functioned as one and contained their gills and reproductive organs. At the end of the Opisthosomal is a long caudal spine called the telson, which, for the record, is not the same thing as the telson in crustaceans, which is a completely unrelated structure given the same name because anatomists are lazy. Regardless of the name, they use it to right themselves if they roll over. In terms of their internal anatomy, the most notable thing is their blue blood, which is due to their usage of hemocyan, a copper-based pigment, instead of vertebrates' hemoglobin, a iron-based pigment. With that, we've covered their anatomy, so let us now discuss their evolutionary history to see how much or how little they've actually changed over time. Alright, so the oldest non-controversial horseshoe crab, Lunataspis, which as a genus lived in what is now the Conservat Lagerskatten of Manitoba from the latest Sandbian state 455 million years ago until the earliest Hernatian stage 445 million years ago in the late Ordovician. Already you can see these guys were quite similar to modern horseshoe crabs, with even their ovaries, which were found in one specimen, being near identical to modern horseshoe crabs. The only notable difference is how their Opisthosomal was divided into several segments, though admittedly they would have functioned in a manner similar to modern ones, not having nearly the flexibility seen in, say, Eurypterids and other silicerate groups. Their overall size was also much smaller, with Lunataspis only reaching 1.6 inches long, with Lunataspis borealis being even smaller, only reaching 1.46 inches long. There was a third species, however, that seemed to deviate from the other, more conservative groups, that being Lunataspis gundersoni, which in addition to being the largest species, reaching a whopping 2.2 inches long, also had an unusual shovel-like head. This species, however, left no descendants and seemingly being little more than an early experiment, with their more standard relatives being likely more related to the ancestors of all further Xiphosurans, aka horseshoe crabs, we'll be discussing today. In the following Silurian, it was until recently a bit of a blank in terms of horseshoe crab evolution, until in 2025, a specimen found in 1975 was finally scientifically described as Cirrura lemulus discobolus, from what is now the Wabash Formation in Indiana, dating to the Ludlow epoch of the Silurian, around 424 million years ago. It obtains its name from its discobolus type shape, but it's most notable for this animal is that it has an unusually elongated opisthosomal. While helpful for filling a gap and indicating the end Ordovician mass extinction event had minimal impact on horseshoe crab evolution, its basal nature and derived elongated opisthosomal indicate that, again, it's likely an aberrant offshoot and thus not the direct ancestor to modern horseshoe crabs. It is, however, in the Devonian that the fossil record picks up again in earnest, with two clades. First are the Cassibellinoridae, which are first seen in the Middle Devonian and last until the period's end. They were far wider / more robust than later horseshoe crabs, think of them like pimmonk, and consist of two genera, the most notable of which is Cassibellinoris americanum, which gets its name because it was presumed to be related to another group we'll talk about in a little bit, but it turns out not to be the case. The second and more relevant are the Xiphosuridae, aka the crown group of the horseshoe crabs. This suborder is distinguished from other, more basal clades by more derived Opisthosomal. They are divided into two infraorders, the Bellinorina and the Limulina. Starting with the older of the two, the Bellinorina consist of only one family, the Bellinoridae, though sometimes a second family or even a third family are recognized, that being Euprympidae and Lyomesupidae, but these are very disputed, and I'll be treating them only as one for this video, which emerged in the Middle Devonian around 409 million years ago and took over the role of the dominant horseshoe crab group, with 11 genera that had marine, brackish, freshwater, and even possibly amphibious forms. They had a partially fused Opisthosomal. Notable members included Bellinurus, whose name had a big controversy on how it is spelled, Alanops, which could roll up in a manner akin to trilobites, the unusually blind and paedomorphic Lyomesaspis, and the funny-sounding yet elegant Euprops. We also have the first representatives of the other infraorder, the Limulina, as well, but we'll return to those guys in a bit. Indeed, the Carboniferous, or Mississippian / Pennsylvanian, is generally considered the golden age of horseshoe crab diversity. But even here, they were not that diverse, with only around 50 species or so. Of course, this number is probably an underestimate given the incomplete nature of the fossil record, but it seems that horseshoe crabs were always a relatively minor aspect of the invertebrate fauna, compared to, say, trilobites, crustaceans, brachiopods, and cephalopods, with the Bellinurina dying out at the end Carboniferous. Returning to the Limulina, this suborder is distinguished from the earlier discussed kin by a fully fused Opisthosomal and generally wide arch-shaped heads. Their most basal genus seems to be the genus Belineurops, which despite the name is probably not a belineurid and dates to the late Devonian/beginning of the Carboniferous. We then come across the contentious family, the Rolfeidae, which are possibly a paraphyletic collection of Mesolimulonine horseshoe crabs that persisted from the Tormesian stage of the Mississippian around 358 million years ago and petered out by the Visinian stage of the Middle Mississippian around 346 million years ago and lived in shallow marine habitats. The remaining horseshoe crabs are divided into two superfamilies. The first of these are the Palaeolimuloidea, which consist of only a single family, the Palaeolimulidae. Despite the name and similar appearance, they are not the direct ancestors of modern horseshoe crabs. Instead, they represent a distinct family, unique for its opisthosomic ridges meeting in the front of the cardiac lobe, a carapace with pyramidal cheek nodes, and distinctly annulated abdominal axes. While mostly marine, a few forms independently transitioned into brackish and even freshwater niches, emerging in the Circadian stage of the Mississippi around 330.3 million years ago until the Asalian stage of the Lower Permian around 298 million years ago, though a contentious form indicates they may have lasted until the Hetganian stage of the beginning Jurassic around 201 million years ago. The other superfamily, the Limuloidea, also showed up in the Carboniferous, but at the time they were a minor aspect of horseshoe crabs, which were already a minor aspect of the invertebrate fauna of the time, in the form of the genus Valoisalia, which had a unique elongated body, but again seems to represent another early short-lived offshoot experimentation and is not the direct ancestor of anything. All the remaining horseshoe crabs consist of two families. First are the Australolimulidae, which were seemingly an entirely freshwater and brackish water dwelling group. Perhaps more interesting than that repeating phenomenon is that they had, according to some paleontologists, some of the most extreme morphologies of the horseshoe crabs, best exemplified by the genus Australimulus itself, whose shell seemingly functioned like a hydrofoil and a defense against predators and reached 7 inches in size. Other notable forms include Vader limulus, a 4-inch long animal that, yes, was named after Darth Vader in the Olenkian stage of the early Triassic around 249 million years ago, and Attenborough limulus, named after who else but the David Frederick Attenborough, a noted science communicator from Britain, which was even smaller, around 1.3 inches long. This group emerged in the Carboniferous/early Permian in the form of animals like Boentaspis or Pandora limulus, around 298 million years ago or so. They took over from the Belineurids, Rolfeids, and Palaeolimulids as the dominant horseshoe crab group in the Permian and Triassic, though it seems the end-Triassic mass extinction event hurt them significantly, with Franco-Limas from the Hetganian stage of the early Jurassic of Germany being the last not-contentious member of the clade, though occasionally Casterolimulis is sometimes placed in the group, which, if true, would extend their survival into the Maastrichtian stage of the Cretaceous of North Dakota around 70 to 66 million years ago. It is, however, their sister family, the Limulidae, we come to the modern or true horseshoe crabs. The exact date of origin of this family is a bit contentious, with the oldest genera of this family being Alba limulus of the Torosian stage of the early Mississippian around 350 million years ago or so, or Volan limulus of the early Triassic around 250 to 246 million years ago in Madagascar. Unlike the Australolimulidae, the Limulidae were overwhelmingly an entirely marine group, unless Casterolimulis ends up being part of this family. Indeed, the genus Mesolimulus looked so identical to the modern horseshoe crabs that until recently it was grouped in Limulus, the same genus as the modern Atlantic horseshoe crab. This was a successful genus emerging in the Landian stage of the Triassic around 241 to 237 years ago, and the last Mesolimulus lasting until the Turonian stage of the late Cretaceous around 93.9 to 89.8 million years ago. Speaking of living horseshoe crabs, there are two subfamilies. The Limulinae, which includes the living Atlantic or American horseshoe crab, Limulus polyphemus, and a single extinct species, Limulus coffini from the Pierre Shale of the Maastrichtian of Montana, and the Tachypleureinae, which consists of two genera, the monotypic Carcinoscorpius, more well known as the mangrove horseshoe crab or round-tailed horseshoe crab, so called for its tail being round in cross-section as opposed to the triangular shape seen in the other two genera, and the genus Tachypleureus, which consists of two living species, Tachypleureus gigas, also called the Indo-Pacific horseshoe crab, the Indian horseshoe crab, the southern horseshoe crab, or the Indonesian horseshoe crab, and Tachypleuris tridentatus, better known as the Chinese horseshoe crab, Japanese horseshoe crab, or the tri-spine horseshoe crab. There are a further two extinct species in this genus, Tachypleuris decini from the Upper Eocene of Germany, and Tachypleus syriacus from the Cenomanian of Lebanon, 95 to 93.5 million years ago. As you can tell, based on the fossil record, the two living genera have been around since at least the Cenomanian stage, but genetic information indicates the split between the two subfamilies happened around 135 million years ago, meaning that all the main genera likely were around at 130 million years ago or so in the Hawthornian stage of the early Cretaceous. Now that we've covered their natural history, let us answer the question you came for, and is the title/thumbnail. Are horseshoe crabs living fossils? So the question is one that sort of ties into the controversy of the term itself, with how in many cases there's a lot of supposed vagueness of the label, though one could counter that English, and by extension all languages, is a bit vague, and something vaguely defined doesn't mean that it no longer exists. I mean, there have been whole debates on what constitutes certain illicit material. I mean, we may not be able to define what constitutes said thing I just mentioned, but we all know it when we see it, right? I view the term living fossil in the same way. I mean, it's a useful way to indicate how a group may have changed relatively less than others to a significant extent. And frankly, I find both sides of this debate incorrect or just sort of missing the point. Creationists are, of course, wrong to say that the horseshoe crab has not evolved at all, since they don't believe in evolution, period. But those who argue that they are not living fossils and have changed and experienced adaptive radiations over time are correct, but also oversimplify the truth. All of the highly unusual aberrant horseshoe crabs sort of weren't all that successful. And indeed, all their freshwater forms, no matter how diverse they may have been at one point, all sort of just couldn't cut the mustard and died out, which is very unusual, since if you know anything about freshwater habitats, they tend to be less impacted by mass extinction events. So clearly there was, more to them failing than just environmental changes. Indeed, it was only the morphologically conservative limulids that survived to this day, and overall it seems that the less derived clades were the more successful ones, lasting for a shockingly long time. So finally, to answer the question of are horseshoe crabs living fossils, the answer is perhaps unsatisfactory in that it is yes and no. No, they haven't remained literally unchanged from the late Ordovician 455 million years ago. Though, if we're being honest with ourselves, they have changed significantly less than, say, contemporary vertebrates. But even limiting ourselves to just the living genera, they've been around since the late Cenomanian, 95 to 93.5 million years ago, or probably even longer given the genetic information, meaning that to me, a genus existing for nearly or slightly over 100 million years still qualifies as a living fossil. I mean, heck, depending on how broad you want to be, the term horseshoe crab, and if you want to include the likes of Mesolimys, they may have gone, further back into the Triassic. So, you know what I mean? Like, Really, at the end of the day, as long as you appreciate these animals and want them to be conserved against excessive exploitation for food and medicine, it really doesn't matter what you call them. And if someone is being pedantic slash neurotic about it, calling you an evil person for calling them a living fossil, I think you should just ignore them. Because, like, there's nothing wrong with calling them a living fossil necessarily, as long as you believe that they're worthy of conservation. Frankly, I think downplaying their evolutionary significance as the last of a great dynasty of animals, as opposed to, merely saying that they've evolved just as much as all those other animals, so they're not really special, only hampers their conservation efforts. But hey, to each his own. Anyway, I'm the Dark Master, and join me next time if you like these nature videos. Sure, they're a lot more niche, and I did kind of have to release this one a little quicker than I intended to due to, well, a certain editing issue with my Kirby Star Allies video. But anyway, don't worry. Next time I got something special for Christmas and the new year. So, yeah.